Hey, hi, hello, welcome. If you're new here, my name is Mel, and I like to deep dive into different topics and overanalyze and break them down in ways I personally find interesting. So today we're going to be talking about millennial literature and consensual sexual violence. I am going to preface this that I cannot find my headphones for the life of me, so I apologize if the sound is a little bit fuzzy. So let's jump right into it. What I've learned in the past few months is that millennials really enjoy writing about sex. Don't get me wrong, there's literally nothing wrong with this. It's just something I've noticed while I'm in millennial literature class. I have noticed that, at least in the books I was assigned to read, that the sex the characters are having is violent in nature. There's a lot of throwing people around, being aggressive, and at times outright physical violence. I would sit there with my headphones on in the kitchen and stare at the wall as I listened to my audiobook, in shock and horror sometimes at the graphic accounts of people engaging in acts of consensual sexual violence. Now, what is consensual sexual violence? It is essentially giving permission to a person to be violent towards you to a certain extent. This often includes some sort of power dynamic in which one person has a significant amount of power over another. The EPE, or erotic power exchange, is the experience of giving one's power over themselves to another person, allowing them to have things done unto themselves that otherwise would not be seen as okay. This dynamic is typically attributed to BDSM. Now you're asking, what is BDSM? It stands for bondage discipline, dominance and submission, and sadism and masochism. While it is largely practiced sexually, BDSM is something that can extend to outside of the bedroom. The name implies a degree of violence, but a key pillar of the BDSM community is consent. Safe, sane, and consensual is a mantra that is often heard repeated time and time again. There is no play without clear, sober, and enthusiastic consent. BDSM dynamics are also often discussed before any type of activity occurs. This means boundaries and safe words are established. Any type of play in this community is also largely centered around care. This means that after a scene or play session, the parties who engaged in such acts often take the time to check in with each other to make sure that all parties feel safe and cared for. Now, why am I going into some of the technicalities of BDSM? I haven't even really mentioned the books I'll be talking to. Well, here it is. In the novels I'll be discussing a little today, I have noticed that while there's a degree of sexual violence, it is rarely called BDSM. This consensual sexual violence is explored, and the dynamics in and outside of the bedroom are very present. I found that the authors struggled to call it what it was. This then brought forth the fact that a lot of sexual violence happens without much discussion, and often without the explicit permission from the receiving party. Keeping this in mind, most of the relationships depicted, save for one I'm going to talk about, have heterosexual sexual content, meaning that these sexual acts occur between a cisgender man and a cisgender woman. These interactions always have the man in the dominant position and the woman in the submissive one. All right, so I'll be focusing on the inclusion of consensual violence that occurs in character relationships throughout the novel. This will be done through a feminist theory lens, focusing more on power dynamics within sexual relationships and how the character's position as either a woman, a person of color, or a member of the queer community impacts these relationships. I'm essentially asking how the structures of sex, sexuality, and power impact the consensual sexual violence the characters are subjected to, and what it implies in the context of millennial views of this type of relationship. To start off with, what is feminist ideology? There isn't really a line to draw on what counts or doesn't count as feminist theory. But in her article, Who's Counting?, Sarah Ahmed discusses that there is no one way to look at feminist theory. It is in the essence of looking at the injustices people experience in relation to the patriarchy and how these systems work in tandem with each other to suppress particular groups of people. Most often, it is used to discuss things from the perspective of a group who is under the control of men and male-dominated practices. Now, keep in mind, feminism isn't anti-men. It's anti-oppressive systems of power that were established by a male-dominated world. It is often seen alongside critical race theory and theories of sexuality. Sex is just as much as part of feminist theory as it can be a part of anything else. While millennials weren't the only ones to pioneer kinky sexual experiences. In fact, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a sexual revolution in which the sexual desires of women were put at the forefront and deemed to be as valuable as the one as those of men. Things that had once previously been kept under wraps started peeking out into the mainstream. The popularization of pornography also pushed the envelope and allowed for a greater discussion on what it meant to have sex and what it looked like. The sexual liberation that occurred also allowed for greater discussion around sexual violence that some people experienced in their relationships and what people viewed sexual violence as. There is a running idea that any sexual relationship involving men inherently has a level of power inequality. This means that the man or one of the men engaging in the sexual activity holds power over the other person and can display this power however they want during the course of their interaction. This idea reinforces the idea that the women or the more feminine aligning people are to be controlled or dominated. The lack of a man in lesbian relationships was seen as inherently soft and gentle, perpetuating the idea that women could not or did not hold any sort of sexual aggression towards one another. This is a structure that has been continued to be held to this day. It is hard to break from the mold. This might be a big reason why femdom relationships are seen as much more taboo than a traditional dom-sub relationship. So the millennial books I read tend to follow this pattern despite attempts to sway from the patriarchal narrative. Looking at the relationship Miller and Wallace have in Brandon Taylor's real life allows for this insight on the power dynamic that occurs between these two characters. Miller is depicted as a typical straight man. He is big, broad, blonde, and white, also hypermasculine. He's the poster child of what a man is believed to be. Wallace, on the other hand, is a gay black man. He is not noted as being flamboyant or feminine in any way, but during his interactions with Miller, he immediately falls into the submissive category. On the surface, this might just be because he's gay, and Miller identifies as straight. However, looking deeper into the idea, what does being gay have to do with being submissive? What power does Miller inherently hold over Wallace if they are both men? Miller is a white man. Wallace is black. The societal structure that they both exist within dictates that Miller will always have some sort of innate structural power over Wallace. This is manifested in their sexual encounters. He immediately goes to penetrate Wallace, and he notes that this is pretty painful. It can be chalked up to the fact that Miller doesn't know the intricacies of gay sex, but when I think about it, it would be the same as if you were going to participate in that kind of act with a woman. There is no asking if it is okay first. He just goes for it full force. This is something that is typically discussed quite heavily before engaging in. It can be noted that it is observed that men, more often than not, see consent as something that happens rather than a process or verbal indication. This might explain Miller's belief that he had the go-ahead with this action, deeming it okay because they were already engaged in sexual behaviors. However, Wallace clearly did not have a voice in this situation. While he notes that he enjoyed it afterward, he did not indicate the go-ahead to Miller before this occurred. This immediately shows the power struggle and dynamic that occurs in their hookup. Miller occupies a position of power both socially, being the popular guy in their friend group, as well as structurally. He automatically defaults to the position of the dom with very little discussion. This continues during most of his sexual exploits with Wallace. In this moment, how is Wallace able to give his sane, safe, and clear consent? Well, he isn't. Miller makes that choice for him, taking the already heated and aggressive encounter as the go-ahead rather than checking in. As a black man and a shy person, Wallace already has a difficult time expressing his feelings or ideas. The sexual experience is something he consents to, and it plays into bigger ideas of what is and isn't clear consent in a relationship and situation like that. This then goes into the idea of hookup culture. When people hook up with each other, it isn't the same as having sex while in a relationship. Typically speaking, it's between people who are, as James Rocha calls it, near strangers. Due to the lack of familiarity between the two parties, a lot of sexual encounters that include men fall into the pattern of aggressive man, passive woman. Culturally speaking, due to the resurgence of kink and sexuality pushing its way into the mainstream, many young people who exist within this dynamic believe that sexual violence is sexy. It's something to aspire to and practice in their own sexual relationships. This can be seen in a lot of media, and this is something I also see coming up in a lot of the millennial books I read this semester. These relationships, sexual or otherwise, are marked by a decent amount of violence, and readers are exposed to them at the will of the author. These violent and aggressive sexual encounters between consenting parties are not painted in a good light, but also not in a bad one. This is situational. I will get into Marianne's relationship with Lucas and normal people. If this aggression is expected in these encounters, there then becomes the issue of consent and where it is located in these situations. In a similar vein, Raven Leilani's Luster follows the story of Edie, a young Black woman who enters a relationship with a married man. In the beginning of the novel, we see that Edie and Eric's relationship has some interesting dynamics. From the get-go, things are a little bit aggressive. She and Eric shove each other around a bathroom stall, with Eric pushing her so hard that she ends up on the floor. After this exchange, Edie straight up asks Eric to punch her in the face. This takes a little bit of convincing from her side, but eventually he does it, leaving a very large bruise on her cheek. This type of exchange is something that would be considered to be consensual violence. Both parties have discussed what they are and aren't comfortable with and interact in ways that fulfill both of their fantasies and lie within a particular realm of existence. However, at the halfway point of the book, the sex, or the lack thereof, takes a turn that leads into murky waters. Well, at the beginning, Edie felt empowered by this type of extreme behavior. The way Eric engages with her violently after returning home from his work trip confuses her. He grabs her by the throat quite harshly, and like Wallace, she doesn't say anything, but it catches her off guard. The gray area exists between the two of them. Eric's sudden aggression is not something that had been previously discussed between the two of them. Yet, both parties find it exciting and exhilarating. Edie feels in control of herself and these situations for the most part. I do believe Eric sees the encounters differently. With each sex scene, we see a desperation within Eric, some sort of animalistic desire to conquer Edie. He is aggressive and rough with her, dominating their time in the bedroom with his wants and needs. This is in direct contrast to his relationship with his wife, Rebecca. They have a loving, lazy sex where they seem happy and comfortable with each other. There is no need for domination or aggression. So what makes Edie so different? She's young, and she's Black. Eric is noted to be at least 10 years older than Edie is. He is very much her senior, and the age gap becomes apparent in scenes where they interact with each other in public, such as the amusement park. He is also an upper middle class white dude. He lives a cushy life in a big house in a nice town. He is everything that Edie is not. She is jobless, poor, and doesn't have a support system. I am making it very clear Edie is an adult woman who can make her own choices, but historically speaking, Black women have experienced all types of violence, but a significant amount of that comes into play sexually. This type of forethought might be a factor in the type of play that Eric engages with her during their sexual encounters. This power dynamic and the role in society that Eric exists within make it difficult to place Edie in any other place other than being at the will of Eric's desires. He immediately plays into his violent tendencies towards women and goes to it full force with Edie. He doesn't consider the role Edie herself might want to play in these moments. Well, at first, she was very vocal about what she was okay with. Eric seemingly takes that power away from her during their later sexual encounters. Eric, perhaps subconsciously, uses his position of power over Edie to complete his sexual fantasies and desires. Like Miller, assuming that since she asked for things like that in the past, it gave him some sort of blanket consent to do other violent things without asking first. There was one relationship that closely aligned with BDSM practices in the novels that I'm discussing. This is the relationship between Marianne and Lucas in Sally Rooney's Normal People. Again, while never explicitly stated, we know that the relationship has a degree of sexual violence in the form of insults and physical restraints. This relationship is interesting in contrast to the others. Marianne is an active player in this situation. She allows Lucas to say and do what he likes to her without much complaint. However, their dom-sub relationship is very complicated when you take into the account the pillars that BDSM finds itself upon: sane, safe, and consensual. It is very, very obvious that for the majority of the book and the show, Marianne is not in a very good state of mind. She allows the people around her, Connell included, to treat her badly. This is something that she feels she deserves rather than something she gets off to. As Danielle Lindenman explores in her article about BDSM as a therapy method, Sometimes being degraded, punished, or treated as less than human can be healing and allows for people to come to terms with guilt or heal past trauma. However, I think in Marianne's case, this does the opposite. She feels awful about herself, and instead of acting these things out as a way to come to terms with the abuse she faced at the hands of her family, or clearing a guilty conscience, which I don't think she has anything to feel guilty about, she uses this type of relationship to reinforce that she deserves to be treated badly. Marianne really is in the state of mind to have things done to her. While she is an adult and she's consenting to these things, safe, sane, and consensual means that a person must be in a particular mindset to allow these things to be done to them. Lucas immediately takes her suggestion that his affection towards her is the root of the problem. He then places her in the submissive position, tying her up and taking explicit photos of her while she barely puts up any protest. Readers or viewers, if you watch the show, are not a part of the consent conversation, but it is clear that the power dynamic that occurs between these two characters is skewed in favor of the aforementioned dom man, sub woman. Lucas, again, is a cisgender man who seemingly enjoys telling Marianne what she can and can't do, making her lay there while he's taking photos, making her lay there silently, and telling her when she can't or can't shower. Marianne, while participating, doesn't seem to enjoy this process. Frankly, she just seems depressed, not taking this type of relationship as a way to heal her trauma and potentially gain some of her autonomy back. Instead, she uses it as a punishment to reinforce her feelings of worthlessness. And eventually, she hits her limit. It is clear that the aspect of care that is typically within this type of BDSM dynamic is not present as well. She's treated terribly and then lacks the reinforcement and comfort that is essential after scenes like this. After Lucas says he loves her, she realizes that the way he's been treating her isn't indicative of a love or healthy dynamic. Marianne's lack of agency in this situation plays into the idea of what she can and can't consent to. Even after having a short conversation with Marianne, one might reveal that she's not in a mental place to be consenting to any of the things that are happening to her. Looking at it broadly, I think millennials enjoy the idea of sex that breaks the bounds of what would once be considered socially acceptable. However, this romanticization of this type of relationship comes with some serious harms. Many people read these books and see relationships like the ones these characters have and think that violence without previous consent might be acceptable. This is exceedingly important to point out that a lot of people do experience this type of violence and don't realize it because this is what they are conditioned to think is okay. There are different dynamics that come into play while having sexual relationship with someone, and having some kinky sex with kinky dynamics can be fun. But we have to remember that assuming someone is cool with something and asking them if they're cool with it are two completely different things. Judging by the actions and relationships of all these characters, they were all active players in the situation and were okay with what was happening to them to an extent. I am not saying that these people cannot give consent because of the dynamics and the way they sway heavily to one side. All parties are consenting adults who are okay with what was happening to them. I'm just pointing out that these dynamics, in a broader sense of the terms, are marred by the fact that these violent things happen to them without their consent being asked or granted first. And the positions of power that their partners hold over them reinforces societal structures and beliefs that immediately place someone in the position of the submissive without having that discussion of what that dynamic might look like in their own sexual relationships. I think that these millennial authors might be hesitant to categorize the relationships in their book under the BDSM umbrella because it comes with a level of taboo. Calling something BDSM and showing that type of dynamic can mean the difference between publishing companies and what kind of audience a book might bring. I also believe that millennials depict this kinky sex as a way of breaking from pre-established norms from the generation and how sex was or wasn't supposed to be done. Thinking about it from this perspective gives us the idea that we are pushing the bounds for sexual relationships and the normalization of kink to the general public. However, nearly all of the consensual violence that occurs falls into what could be considered BDSM practices. While not as extreme as the videos on certain websites or the way we might imagine dungeons to look like, it is still a part of that BDSM kink culture. Acknowledging something as BDSM also means that you have to acknowledge the things that are happening in the relationships that might not always be seen as safe, sane, or consensual, which can cause some ethical issues and shift perspectives of the relationships you are trying to pass off as passionate or affectionate. So I've come to the end. I wanted to say thank you for listening, and I'm very open to comments and feedback on what you guys might have to say about the video essay. I hope you're all doing well, and I hope to see you guys again next time. Thank you so much.